Tonight I'd like to take you on a journey back through time to a period in history lost, or as skeptics would have you believe, never existed in the first place. In particular, I will examine the astonishing theory of Atlantis by Germanic scientist Dr. Otto Muck, a physicist, geophysicist, nutritionist and engineer. Now, it's without doubt that everyone has heard of Atlantis. Skeptics of the Atlantis mystery will tell you that all of the supposed evidence of the existence of Atlantis and its subsequent demise comes from one written source, and that this was authored by Plato, a man renowned as a writer of works of fiction. They believe that he wrote the accounts in Timaeus and the Critias dialogues as vehicles for his political beliefs, wishes and warnings for a utopian society. Plato, however, stated time and again that the work was not fiction, but a historical fact. According to London Theosophist Nigel Blair, who gave a talk on the riddle of Atlantis, and I'm not sure what the date of his talk was, and a copy of his talk Diane loaned me, many philosophers and thinkers think of Atlantis as either the greatest riddle of prehistory or the greatest mystery recently solved in prehistory. Briefly, in Plato's Critias dialogue, it was noted that certain perturbations in the movement of heavenly bodies occur periodically, causing the destruction of millions of lives. After these cataclysms, mankind lapses again into barbarity and forgets the art of writing. The Athenians remember, for instance, only one world deluge, when in fact there have been several. These manuscripts he is referring to from Egyptian hieroglyphs contain the description of a war between the Athenians and an ancient nation who inhabited a great island in the Atlantic Ocean. In the neighbourhood of that island there were others, and beyond them, at the limit of the ocean, was a great continent. That was almost certainly a reference to America, and this was written about 330 BC. This island called Poseidus, or Atlantis, was ruled by kings to who also belonged the neighbouring islands. Moreover, they were masters of Libya and of the lands around the Tyrrhenian Sea. Now, Libya meant virtually all of North Africa at the time. And keeping in mind too that at the time the Sahara Desert was actually an ocean. So Africa itself looked a little bit different to what it does now. Now, when Europe was invaded by the Atlantean army, the valour of the head of the Greek coalition in the city of Athene saved Greece from the Atlanteans. Now, these events were soon followed by a dreadful cataclysm. A violent earthquake tore the earth asunder, and heavy and lasting rains flooded it. The Greek troops perished, and Atlantis sank beneath the ocean. Some writers, such as David Hatcher Childress, claims that the ancient Sanskrit text known as the Vedas, which I believe date back around 12,000 years, makes reference to the two superpowers of their day, the Atlanteans and the Indian Rami Empire, both of whom had technology that, when described today, sounds very much like the technologies available today, including flying vehicles such as the ones called the Vimanas and nuclear weapons. He also gave a snippet of the text which describes a conflict between the Atlantis and Rami Empire, which ends in the detonation of nuclear devices. Now, famed clairvoyant Edgar Cayce from the 1930s claimed that Atlantis was destroyed by its own technology, the harnessing of a power source from a crystal that was able to power all the vehicles, ground, sea and air, as well as all the homes of the island, and also being able to provide health and that type of thing to people as well. Now, that reminded me of the talk that I had at our previous meeting, in which it was mentioned about the 1960s film that we both saw, in which Atlantis did meet the end from that same weapon. What the case also says is that that weapon was never powered down, and in the process it is the reason why things go missing in the Bermuda Triangle, because occasionally the weapon or the power source cycles around and accidentally hits a particular vehicle flying overhead or overhead in the water, and is destroyed along with the human inhabitants. Now, Edgar Cayce also claimed that Atlantis would resurface in the 1960s. And to my knowledge, that hasn't happened, although I have heard that there have been some lowering of sea levels in certain areas where some things have been found where people think may have been remnants of some of the outer colonies of Atlantis. Now, most of these are in the near the Bahamas and that type of area, I think. Right, Bahamas? Yeah. While I think of that also, I keep in mind that nearly every country in the world has laid claim to Atlantis. The Indians, for example, claim that Atlantis lies off its shores, and the Japanese have claimed that it lies off their shores, even though, as far as I understand, it quite clearly says that it was supposed to be in the Atlantic Ocean. But I'll go further into one of the other theories in a few moments about where they claim Atlantis is, and that's a scientific theory which is gaining more ground at the moment, but which I still feel is wrong. But Otto Muck argues that the catastrophe of Atlantis was such that it all but destroyed human civilization and most flora and fauna surrounding the Atlantic Ocean and most of the northern hemisphere at the time. The destruction was so great that the only thoughts were of survival. For the few who did survive, trying to find nourishment and shelter were the only concerns. The lack of cave paintings for the period, about the time of the cataclysm, survive, trying to find nourishment, shelter with the only concern. The lack of cave paintings for the period from about the time of the cataclysm to about 2,000 years later is cited as proof. Now, this would also explain the apparent lack of written records of the event. Eventually, through only verbal history, the event was lost in time, a victim of fading memories and Chinese whispers. Now, to start tonight, I thought I'd like to mention a little bit about Otto Muck. He was born in Vienna in 1892. He served in World War I as a flying officer. After the war, he studied at Munich College of Advanced Technology, gaining a qualification as an engineer. He continued studying in the fields of physics, geophysics, and early history. Now, in the Second World War, he was the inventor of the U-boat snorkel. I don't know what it is, but I believe it had a lot to do with the success of the U-boats. And he was also a member of the Peenemünde rocket research team. So a fairly clever person, and I believe that he was one of the people instrumental in the guided missile.
The snorkel enabled the U-boat to take on fresh air without actually surfacing.
So staying underwater longer. Yeah, so that obviously meant that they had an advantage over the Allies in that regard. Yeah. At the time of his accidental death in 1956, he held over 2,000 patents. Most of them were in the field of nutrition. Now, his book on Atlantis was called Alles über Atlantis, or The Secret of Atlantis, which I have here. and was the result of a personal interest in the subject which spanned over 30 years. To this day, his theory has not been effectively refuted. Now, findings of Minoan ruins around Santorini or Thera in the Mediterranean Sea have led many scientists of today to claim that these are the remains of Atlantis, despite the fact that the destruction of the Minoan civilization occurred somewhere around about 900 BC, I think, not 9000 BC. And this was not in the Atlantic Ocean, it wasn't beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and it didn't have a large continent beyond it, which could only have been the Americas, as I mentioned earlier. Now, one of the major reasons for the belief that Thera is the lost Atlantis is that the only remains of the island are a number of concentric circles. It was reported by Plato that the capital of Atlantis was built as a series of concentric rings leading to the king's palace. No doubt the circles of Thera were simply created by the destructive force of the volcanic eruption. They weren't man-made. Now, those of you who are regulars to the Lodge are probably aware that many of the talks that I give usually relate to ufology or flying saucers, aliens and or sex. But this talk tonight will be no exception. For all these subjects are a part of the Atlantis lore. All of them have been explored in books on Atlantis. From the Atlanteans being a colony of aliens sent here to observe human development, to the Atlanteans creating their own flying saucers and evacuating their people to safer planets, and to the important part that Atlantis played in the life cycle of the European eel. Now, there are many aspects to this story, from the origins and understanding of isotherms, the understanding of the creation of the wind, change of axis, planetary wobble, cessation of the Quaternary Ice Age and withdrawal of the ice glaciers to their present positions, the Carolina meteorite shower, commencement of the Quaternary Age, the sex life of the European eel, the mystery of the extinction of the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros, the post-diluvial world, the religious myths and legends, and creationism, to name a few. So where do we begin? Continental drift, as postulated by Alfred Wegener in the early 1900s, suggested that for some reason, due to extreme geophysical forces millions of years ago, the continents which had begun their life as one single body tore apart and began drifting away from each other. Now, when the continents drift apart, they continue to travel in the direction they were travelling at the time of the separation, unless something happens to cause the individual continents to change their courses. Now, geophysicists study continental drift and can map these changes in direction. Such changes are indicative of something major, such as an asteroid strike or planetary wobble. Geophysicists studying the Atlantic Ocean have determined that there has been a change in direction in the South American continental drift, which can only be explained by an asteroid strike. Now, according to the work of Wegener, there was only a small mass of land missing when putting the continents back together again. But argued by Otto Muck, the shelves do not match. The only match is the South Atlantic between South America and Africa. Wegener seemed to err in putting the jigsaw puzzle back together again, or the inaccuracy of his puzzle solution was due to the difficulty he had in putting the continents together by hand. Now, with modern technological mapping, it became evident that a significant landmass was missing. And one of the things that Theosophy teaches about Atlantis is that it was once a rather large body, a lot larger than the one I've drawn here, which extended further down to This is supposed to be about the Gulf of Mexico here, so it's not very well in proportion, but it extended a fair way down, a great big chunk like this, but it suffered two previous cataclysms to the one that it had there before that, one around about 50,000 BC and the next about 28,000 BC, and then finally the last one, which destroyed the entire island. Okay, so isotherms. Isotherms are important in explaining a strange aspect of the weather around the North Atlantic. Now, I've got them over this side. Normally isotherms reach about the same latitude on both sides of the ocean, as you can see in the blue here. This is supposed to be England, and that's supposed to be Portugal and Europe and whatever. This is supposed to be Northern America, where the glaciers are supposed to still be, and where they were at the time of the end of the Ice Age. Now, the difference is the red bit up there, not to scale, of course, of a shift in the isotherm higher up, which effectively meant that it was possible for the glaciers to start to recede, because that particular isotherm was the 0 degrees isotherm, which was the one that, well, as you know, the melting point of water, of ice, or the freezing point of water is 0 degrees Celsius, and that's basically where it ended. It was shown that in England, for example, the isotherm extended as far down as the Thames, down to London. So, and evidence of bowlers and the like proved that. So something changed to that second isotherm, the red one, veering up further. In fact, it had more of a bulge than what I've got drawn there, but that's my artistic abilities being shown off there. Now, that which wasn't under ice was simply a swampy, boggy hole that was good for trapping quarry and certainly not very good for habitation and the establishment of a civilization which would require agriculture to survive. So, obviously there was a major change. Now, the major change happened at the time of the change from the Ice Age. So around about that 10,000 year mark, that isotherm changed. Now the next thing to look at is the Gulf Stream, which is this thing here and also refers to this thing here. In a perfect sphere, which is revolving around itself on its axis and which has water in it, or even if it was just a rocky outcrop with an atmosphere. What happens in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere is you have different vortexes occurring. In the top one, you have a clockwise winding of the currents and winds in a clockwise direction. In the south, it's the anti-clockwise. And what that does, it actually creates the Gulf Stream, which in this instance was here, which is in the northern hemisphere. It was at the time of Atlantis. There it is in the blue, where it's actually hitting Atlantis and bouncing back and coming back and starting the cycle again. Now, after Atlantis was gone, it's that green one that goes all the way up there past England and higher than England, I think, up and back down and travelling back around here. So the journey is a lot longer. Is there something wrong?
No.
So the journey was a lot longer. What it did, effectively, it brought with it the temperate temperatures, I guess, if you like, and the better conditions for people to live in. an ideal land when you compare to the temperatures and that type of thing that exist in Northern Europe now. Northern Europe at the time was in the midst of Ice Age. It wasn't, because of the Gulf Stream in particular. It presented it with a paradise, basically. So, that brings us to the sex life of the European eel. Now, so where does the sex life of the European eel come into the story of Atlantis? Now, the eel larvae starts its life in the Sargasso Sea, a sea filled with tightly packed seaweed, a perfect hiding place for predators and a perfect place for reproduction. But a curious thing happens. Instead of remaining in the relative safety of the seaweed, the immature eels or larvae risk exhaustion and death to enter the Gulf Stream and travel the almost 2,000 kilometres to the shores of Europe. Now, the voyage takes 3 years. There, the males wait patiently in the sea whilst the immature females make their way up the freshwater rivers. Now, the females return to journey back with the males after 2 years of maturing sexually in the fresh water. The return journey to the Sargasso Sea mating grounds takes a much shorter 140 days, perhaps because there is an incentive to do so. Now, amidst the seaweed tangle, mating occurs, followed by the deaths of the old fish and hatching of the larvae. The cycle then continues once again. Now, it seems that in order to mature sexually, the female eel must spend time in fresh water. The question is, why should the eel make such an arduous journey, particularly when freshwater rivers exist less than a third of the distance away on the shores of the Americas rather than the shores of Europe? Now, believe it or not, the arduous journey of the European eel is proof that at one time Atlantis really existed. Eels are instinctual creatures. They are driven by their instinct to leave the safety of the Sargasso Sea, to take the perilous and lengthy journey outlined above, to provide the female eel with the opportunity to sexually mature and thus to breed. Now, according to Otto Muck, Atlantis was at least 400,000 square miles in size. The Atlantis coast, facing the Gulf Stream, easily blocked it and sent it back to the Gulf of Mexico. The journey was far shorter, only about a third of the length of the journey to Europe, and allowed the females to travel up the freshwater rivers of Atlantis instead, where they were able to mature and return far more quickly to the safety of the Sargasso Sea and a longer sex life with their mates. And keep in mind that was still a 2-year wait for the guys, so I don't know what they were doing for 2 years. So the question must be asked, what causes the change to the 0 degree Celsius isotherm? What caused the Gulf Stream to reach the European shores and help to thaw the glaciers? And what caused the European eels to continue to make such an arduous journey? Quite by accident in the 1930s, the answer to these questions began to emerge. An aerial photo recon mission was commissioned by the North Carolina and South Carolina governments to carry out a new photogrammetric survey. Now, surprisingly, the resultant photographs showed a crater field littered with over 10,000 craters. Now, it became known as the Carolina Crater Field and was centred around the city of Charleston and was part elliptical in shape, extending as far as the Atlantic coast, which is dotted with bays, large, formerly deep, but now peat-filled troughs. They are the holes created by the impact of a meteorite that had fallen from the sky about 10,000 years ago. Oops. Did I have it somewhere? Yeah, those little funny red things there, those little red dots, are supposedly the crater field, and there's supposed to be 10,000 craters there. And it was roughly an elliptical shape, and there's 2 puncture marks of another one with a Now, Otto Muck calculated that he's a fairly precise fellow. He calculated that at 8 p.m. on the 5th of June 8,498 BC. Very accurate. That an asteroid from the Adonis group of asteroids, which he called asteroid A, entered the Earth's atmosphere on its terminal journey after having been caught by the combined gravitational pull of the Moon, Earth and Venus. Now, as one of the Adonis group, asteroid A had circled the Sun in an eccentric elliptical orbit, which intersected the orbits of the inner planets of Mars, Earth, Venus and Mercury. It was calculated that due to the debris field of the Carolina crater field and the two gigantic holes in the Atlantic Ocean, that asteroid A was about 10 kilometres in diameter. Now, as it entered the Earth's atmosphere from the northwest, the asteroid was travelling at 15 to 20 kilometres per second at an angle of 30 degrees. Now, if this were the Earth, of course, it's coming around this way, so it's had to actually catch up with the rotation of the Earth to actually land on land anyway, or even on the ocean, because the Earth rotates in that direction. So it's come across on that 30 degrees angle and ploughed into the Carolinas and then there. So the temperature of its front surface grew to over 20,000 degrees Celsius, and its luminosity was between 20 and 100 times that of the Sun. Now, eyes that saw it would have been permanently blinded. The core broke in two with a thunderclap that ruptured every eardrum. Each giant boulder weighed about 10 to the power of 12 tonnes. Now, I can't tell you what that is. I can't even imagine 10 to the power of 12 tonnes, but it's a lot. They both plunged into the ocean, which surged to mountainous heights. A stupendous tidal wave rushed in all directions from the vortex around the impact holes. At a height of 600 metres, it caused appalling devastation in coastal regions and extinguished all traces of antediluvian civilization there. Now, the impact was heard in every part of the Earth, except by those who lived in the explosion strip. They would be dead before the sound could reach them. As the two giant asteroids struck the ocean floor, that's those two red things there, they punched holes 7 kilometres deep into and through the Earth's crust into magma, tearing a fault line into the length of the Atlantic ridge and immediately activating all the volcanoes in the area. It was calculated that the hit was equivalent to the combined detonation of 30,000 nuclear bombs. As well, the damaged seam along the length of the Atlantic ridge spewed out magma into the ocean. Now, this action fueled the explosion of matter, ash, pumice, and extreme amounts of water high into the atmosphere. Gigantic clouds developed. The magma kept pouring out of the seam, and the action continued until such times as the pockets of magma was exhausted. Now, a vacuum was caused by the outpouring of magma under the seam and its tectonic plate. Now, under Atlantis, by the way, there was, unfortunate for Atlantis, but the tectonic plate went up around here somewhere and kind of divided in two here and went up further, so there was kind of like its own separate little plate in the middle. So everything above the plate, including Atlantis, was swallowed up by the vacuum. Atlantis was buried under hundreds of metres of mud and pumice and 2 kilometres of ocean and dissolved into the Earth's mantle. All that remains are the Azores Mountains that rise majestically out of the Atlantic Ocean. All of this was calculated by Otto Muck to have taken a mere 24 hours, which coincides with what Plato believed stated anyway. Now, the sky darkened and the light of day would not be seen for approximately 2,000 years. Rains of mud, pumice and water fell to Earth in volumes too hard to comprehend. The dust reaching the very high levels of the atmosphere remained there for several thousand years. Plant life died off The relative recent destruction of Krakatoa was minute by comparison. Pumice fell to land and sea alike, and in places was calculated to be at least 100 metres thick. As in the Bible, for 40 days and 40 nights, the earth was deluged by tsunami and rain that saw the extinction of most life on earth in the northern hemisphere. The only survivors were those living in the high mountains. Many of those who survived the destruction and flood died soon enough from lack of food. Those cities that may have escaped the deluge would have been buried by pumice, leaving no trace of any great civilizations that may have flourished there. Also, the ocean would have been unsurpassable due to a thick 100-metre film of pumice and mud. Autopsies on woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. What's the plural of rhinoceros? Rhinoceri? Rhinoceroses. Found in the frozen wastelands of Siberia show the suddenness of their deaths. Many still had unprocessed food in their stomachs. They were carried and dumped in the wasteland and were promptly snap frozen. The question as to why no small animals were found with them is answered by their size. The heavier animals sank first, while the small animals were carried further away. So as a result of the cataclysm, the Gulf Stream changed its course and reached the northern European continent, which is in the green arrow there. The Earth had wobbled slightly due to the hit and was momentarily knocked off its axis. Weather patterns changed due to the contributing factors of the now unobstructed path of the Gulf Stream to Europe. The volcanic activity had caused partial meltdown of the glaciers and the increase in the height of the ocean from between 30 and 200 metres. The British Isles were no longer a part of the European continent. The shelf by which they travelled to Europe was now submerged. The Gulf Stream brought with it a new isotherm that helped recede the glaciers and make Europe habitable. With the ending of the Ice Age in Europe, the sea rose by at least 300 feet over a couple of thousand years, and the British Isles became islands. Excuse me a second. Helena Blavatsky writes that the Atlanteans were the fourth root race of this round of humankind. The Atlantean root race lasted many millions of years and experienced several cataclysms during that time. Now it's claimed that, as I mentioned earlier, that the Atlantis extended from the Azores down to near Mexico, but was systematically destroyed by catastrophic earthquakes and volcanic activities around 50,000 BC and 28,000 BC. It's also stated that the Lemurians and the Atlanteans had giant bodies. Now incidentally, Otto Muck writes of the giants being Cro-Magnon man, the Atlantean racial type, who are at over 7 feet, towered over their recent types of man, such as the Australian Aborigine at about 6 feet and Neanderthal man at about 5.5 feet. So I stated earlier that Atlantis may very well have existed and that its memory was lost to us because of the catastrophe and the pure and only need to survive. Generations of survival would have passed before safety could be guaranteed, and by then the memory would have been lost to those long since dead, or only through oral citation, for the skill of writing and recording had been lost. The cycle of humanity restarting and eventually destroying itself begins once again. To those critics who say that there is no evidence of submerged Atlantis, I answer that it wasn't submerged, it was buried by hundreds of metres of mud, pumice, 2 kilometres of ocean, and was consumed by the molten core of the earth, leaving nothing in the way of buildings or streets or items of civilization to find. My conclusion is that Atlantis existed. It had a thriving economy and was a centre of trade and influence. It died at the hands of a wayward asteroid, a smaller version perhaps of the asteroid strike that wiped out the dinosaurs. But nonetheless, the cataclysm was an event that almost wiped out all of mankind and all animal and vegetable life in the northern hemisphere. Archaeological, geological and anthropological evidence supports Otto Muck's astonishing theory, which to this day has not been refuted. Believe it or not.
With the Minoans, you stated that problems with that was it wasn't to the west of the Pillars of Hercules, it wasn't in the Atlantic. There is the civilization of the Black Sea that I mentioned earlier, and the Greeks and the Egyptians both agreed that the Phrygians, I think that's how you pronounce it, were even older than their own cultures, which they said Phrygians were the oldest of the races, and they were known from the area of the Black Sea, closely associated, if not identical, with the Amazons, and the famous Phrygian camp that cropped up in the French Revolution again, and in Mithra for that matter, but I'm getting off the subject. The Pillars of Hercules weren't necessarily at the entrance to the Atlantic. They could have been to the entrance to the Black Sea, where there are similar pillars, and they were associated with Hercules, with Jason, and the Argonauts and so on. And the fact that the Atlantic Ocean is called the Atlantic is only because that's where Atlantis was supposed to have been. It's sort of, I still think the Minoans have a good case, particularly if the Atlanteans were the enemies of the Athenians, because it goes Minoan, Mycenaean and such. The Athenians weren't around much before that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on what story you believe regards to who the enemies were. But as I mentioned earlier about the Rami Empire, the claims that it had fought wars, fought the wars before the Great Deluge and that type of thing.
Excuse me, Tony, what empire did you...
The Rami.
Oh, Rami.
Which some claim is evidenced in the Sanskrit text, particularly in the Vedas, claiming that they'd had a war with the Atlanteans. But then any great civilization, as we're aware, would have, when they become centres of influence, they are in fact, take the Romans and the Greeks, everything, they all invade. They all civilise other nations themselves by going and invading them and the like. And Atlantis, I would think, would be no different in that regard, no matter where it was situated. I guess one of the reasons that people also believe, as you said, Atlantis being in the Atlantic Ocean, was because in every great ocean, the oceans are named after the place that was there. In the Pacific, there's the Pacific Islands. In the India, it's whatever, the Indies or whatever. So they're all supposedly named after the great nations within them.
The name Atlantis wasn't necessarily what theoretically the people would have called it. It was a name given by probably Plato or whoever to signify that that's where he thought it was, in the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I mean, it had a few names. I mean, Poseidus was one of them. I mean, that was the Greek name, wasn't it, Poseidus?
There's also the aspect from the theosophical point of view that the Atlantean age isn't simply about a continent in the Atlantic Ocean, it's about an era around planet Earth.
Yeah.
And that the peoples of South America and the North American Indians, the Asian peoples, and particularly the Mongolians, are all part of Atlantis, or of the Atlantean groupings. And it's sort of like if we'd say today we had a disaster in New York, and it affects the whole world because it was a major disaster, but it's only one part of the world. So if there's a disaster in, say, the Atlantic Ocean, it may have been a centre of civilization, like, say, New York is at the moment, but it's not all of civilization.
Yeah.
So I think in the process over time, a lot of stories have interwoven around one another, so that what we have today through Plato's version may be a mixture of several streams.
Well, that plus Chinese whispers.
Yes, but I know the Japanese have off the coast of Japan a sunken area of buildings which include pyramids, apparently, according to divers.
That's only just been found recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Off the coast of India, there is a submerged city they found only about 2 years ago. So if you go around the world, there are submerged.
Oh yeah. I mean, look at off India. Was it India with the after the tsunami? There was an older city, I guess, that was seen out to sea that had never been seen before, only because the water had withdrawn from the ocean, from the continent, from the shelf, or whatever. And that exact thing is proof, really, that of one of my premises that I've always believed in, and that was that life has cycles and humanity has cycles, and it'll get to the stage where it blows itself up or is destroyed and then starts again and blows itself up and destroyed, all starts again, and that these cycles have occurred time and time again, and that they're hidden in time because of various factors. Now, what does 10,000 years do to our modern homes? We don't know, because we can't look 10,000 years into the future. Will it do the same thing as it did to homes 10,000 years ago, where all that's left is maybe a few clay tiles and nothing else, because the wood, of course, rots away and all these other things. So all these different cultures could very well have gotten to a stage that are fairly far advanced, but there's no evidence of it.
I know up in the Andes, some of those structures up there, they have no idea how old they are, but they're built with incredible engineering skills to get the stone walls. They're built to take the earthquakes, so there's a particular way they've been put together. It isn't just stone put together, it's engineered. And that reflects there was some great level of culture there at one point in time.
Has anyone picked up on the pyramid that they're supposedly uncovering in the Balkans at the moment?
Have you seen they showed a little bit of it this morning on Sunrise, I think it was, and they said, they were claiming it was, this great pyramid, and that they'd gotten out this triangular section or whatever, and it was nothing. It was just piles of dirt just edged over that way, and it could very well have been just a natural...
The earlier reports was that it was a natural pyramid-shaped hill that was coated in, it was finished off and coated in flagstones.
Well, that could have been the case, I guess, but it certainly wasn't made to the exacting of like either Egyptian pyramids or to the Mayan or whatever else. And that was something too, part of the Mayan culture was a part of the Atlantis myth as well, and that they were a part of the, or it seems to be a part of the a part of the civilization. They were either outland of Atlantis or of its centre of influence, or they were a part of. according to the Mayan calendar, which when it started, it actually started at a time which coincides with the destruction of Atlantis, which was what they could call day zero. And from day zero, the calendar goes forward and seems to end in 2012 or 2013 or something. So
There's a little asterisk stuck in the top right-hand corner of that stone that says repeat. I don't know what it means, but that's the information I've got.
and maybe it's right. Like some of these 100-year calendars that we've got,
Yep.
they're just
You just
100
repeat,
calendars.
it just goes around. When's the filling of the Mediterranean, when that filled? What's the date? Has anyone got any dates on that?
Well, they claim that the filling of water, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, they claim that it coincides with.
Yeah, I know that it took 70 years for it to fill, except when they reckon they've estimated, but I was just wondering what, and so that was about 10,000 years ago, was it?
Well, they claim that and the emptying of the Sahara Sea happened around at the same time.
Oh,
And again, all caused by the same cataclysm, and like with the oceans increasing their height by up to 300 feet or more.
Because there's a fellow done a little bit of diving and research in the Mediterranean, and they're finding stuff on the bottom that doesn't coincide with any civilisations around there that exist. And their theory is that there was, if it's a great big open valley, and of course people were living there, but they said that the structures they're finding weren't nomadic, they're more than that.
Yeah, I mean, well, even if you just look back here again at the Americas with the Carolina craters, it's suggested that Charleston, which is about the middle there somewhere, almost in the middle of the crater field, it's right on the edge of the coast, whereas prior to that, the coast came out here somewhere. And so most of that was wiped away by the destruction caused by either the fall of the meteorite or the asteroid, or by the other stuff that happened afterwards, which was the deluge and the like.
Last year there was a documentary, not about Atlantis, but just about the peculiar nature of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And it is a peculiar region, supported the Mayan civilization without having a river, yet there are a number of sinkholes that were interconnected, and really sort of an underground water source that they were able to access. And part of that documentary was talking about a meteorite hit creating the Gulf of Mexico in fairly recent geological terms, history, and the sinkholes being largely another series of holes, such as in the Carolinas.
It's interesting that you said the survivors are giants. Now, throughout the world mythology, there are giants spoken about, particularly in Greek mythology, Irish mythology. They're the ones that come to hand, but there are many others that.
But by
that
giants,
have
they're not talking
giants.
about 20 feet tall or anything.
Yeah.
They're talking about people
Yeah, but
who
they're
are...
bigger than what the
Yeah,
Normans.
yeah. And when you
of
look at
course they will be giants.
When you look at the skeletons that they show in the book there, or the drawings of the skeletons, the size difference looks huge when you put them next to each other, but you're only talking about a couple of feet. But a couple of feet make all the difference. I mean, I remember walking up the street the other day and saw a woman who was only about 4 foot next to me, and I look like a giant over her. And it's a similar type of thing,
There is well, they've proved it now, that there were a race of people in the Americas that was similar to the Australian Aboriginal. And then when the Asian came in across the top, they gradually pushed them away out, and there's a small remnant of the genetic structure right down the bottom of South America, and so that they would be classified as giants because if you're an Asian and your average height's 4'8", and you've got these 6 foot whatevers wandering around with whatever they've got, the body structure and everything, I'd call them giants. I mean, if I stand next to one of these American basketball players, he's a giant.
But some of these guys could have been up to 8 feet tall, which is still pretty tall. And I would call it a giant.
The drawings 1, 2 and 3.
Can you? Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was basically the demise of Atlantis and how it happened. In these ones, you're looking at the normal, what Atlantis was normally like. Now, this here is the, I guess, the magma, the red stuff there. I think this is simmer here. Now, simmer is the harder material that sits on the basalt. And when the strike happened, the magma started throwing up through here and weakening this section here to the point that when it was all expelled, this had nowhere to go but to collapse downwards, and thus Atlantis actually sunk further into the ocean, into the bed floor. The only thing left was the Azores, which is supposed, that's my representative of the Azores just there, that little bit there, above the water, and the rest of it's pretty much underwater. This is taken from a sounding of the ocean floor in the 1890s, I think, by sounding machines that were used to calculate where they could put the Atlantic cable. And they found that they had this kind of ridge on the bed of the ocean. And when you consider that, you know, if you've got hundreds of metres of junk and everything being piled on top of it, that you would have something perhaps as evidence that something lay underneath it, but you'd never get to it, you never did, because most of it was in this strata here, which was all melted, destroyed, so yeah, there's nothing left.
Well, that's one of the main objections that the Theosophy Science Nazis have to the whole idea of Atlantis. They're stating that the whole area has been thoroughly surveyed and there just isn't any evidence of a sunken continent.
Well, I mean, as such, there's no evidence of a sunken continent because there's nothing left other than these mountains coming out of the ocean here, which come out of an ocean when and being weathered less than what they'd normally be had they been under the ocean for longer than 15,000 years or whatever. 15,000 years, the mountains underwater would weather more than the ones that are there now, and it's suggested that that's why, because it's sunk, and what's it, 8,498 years BC, which is still a few thousand years under the weathering of the geology, which, according to him, who's a specialist in geology and geophysics, that was why. Great artwork, isn't it?
So it's well within the sort of Mesolithic and Neolithic eras where there could have been some oral communication carried forward. It could have been mixed up. I'm still sort of stuck on the Minoan, but I think there might be two. There was obviously a cataclysm around the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh, there was, yeah. But it's cataclysm. I mean, like Krakatoa and the Minoan one, it definitely happened. There's no doubt. But one of the big claims of them was that the concentric rings were proof that it was Atlantis. And well, all they are the remains of the blown-up island. I mean, that's not the remains of man-made structures that are concentric circles. If you can show me the concentric circles that were made up of mankind, I'd be thinking, well, maybe you're right. But at this stage, I still kind of tend to believe that this is what happened here.
Probably the interesting thing too is, even though there's not, I should say, a great lot of written historical information, when you actually go into all the various myths around the world, they all have floods.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether it's American Indians, the Hindu Indian traditions, right throughout the world, the Australian Aboriginals, they all had this concept at one time there was a flood.
Well, all you've got to do is look at the Bible.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the description given of 40 days, 40 nights, and 150 days for the deluge to recede, recede. That period of time was, I mean, it all makes sense. I mean, that 40 days, 40 nights is about the kind of amount of water that he claimed when Otto Muck calculated it, said would be about that much water in the Earth's atmosphere. He calculated it pretty well. I mean, I didn't understand the maths, but it was quite fascinating to read. And again, no one has actually refuted him at this stage. Certainly there have been some people who have over 20,000 books written on the subject at the time that he wrote the book. He wrote the book sometime prior to his death in 1956, yeah. Why hasn't anyone been able to refute him? Well, because he knew more than them.
Did Plato,
It's a live theory.
did Plato offer any, or is there any references to where he got his original information from? Did he cite any sources or anything?
Oh, yeah, it was his maternal grandfather's friend, I think it was, Solon, went to Egypt and spoke to an Egyptian priest, and the Egyptian priest told him about this story. He'd gone up to a pillar that had hieroglyphics on it and started to decipher it for him and let him know what had happened, because apparently he'd said something like, we're Athenians, we're Greeks, we're the best in the world type of thing. And he said, look, young man, you know nothing about the Greek culture. Greek history goes back thousands of years before your people even existed. And there was this great tribe and there's a great civilization that existed in Greece thousands of years before your time, and your people don't know about it. Here's the evidence, and he went through and told him the story. And then that told him the story about Atlantis as well. But then when you look at the Vedas with the talk of Atlantis, supposedly about the talk of Atlantis and Rami, we don't know, because I've never seen a copy of the Vedas. I don't know what you know, but
Zora's going to try and look it up for me, because she says she knows where that quotation is.
yeah, because
It's finding out where these quotes are.
well, it's finding out where these people are getting it from, because some people who have written these things have been people who are a little bit way out in the ufology circles, and whether you can trust their writings. Not that I don't believe in ufology, I'm a staunch follower, but there are some who are a little bit further out than others.
I don't have on it's actually music from Mahabharata. There's a part of the song which talks about the god of hearing, and the wanderer who's been caught up in the flood goes into his mouth and has a rest and comes back out again. And it's, the whole piece is very much a story of a flood, destruction and a resting time. I'll have to dig that one out for you too. It's only very short, but it's and I'm not quite sure what the background is to that particular story, but
That plus I'd like to see more of the Vedas.
Vedas, yes.
To be able to see where a lot of these things come from, and being able to get one that was translated
Yes.
properly, because it may very well be anyone can say, well, this is what it really says. I know. I mean, I write a book on how the flying saucers came into it and all that kind of stuff as well, couldn't I?
A few years ago, there was just a brief news item saying they finally discovered some road works or something off Bimini, I think it was.
Yes.
That was seem to develop into anything that was just an item on the evening news.
There was a fair bit of underwater photography and stuff done in regard to that. And yeah, you're right, it's disappeared.
I do know that, like a few of those, they've shown them, and then the question mark after it has been whether they're man-made or natural.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these things look man-made,
Yeah.
but it's whether they are man-made or natural.
But one of the reports I saw on that said that they'd done an electromagnetic alignment of the rocks and whatever, and their problem was that the rocks weren't all magnetically aligned. There were some that were cross-sections and some that weren't. So they weren't all laid down with the same magnetic polarity. They've got different polarities in the rocks, and that's what they're scratching their heads together. They're trying to work out how that can be and still make it natural. That's what they were trying to prove. So.
And one of the things I was alluding to, I guess, when I was talking about the Azores here and the weathering of the mountains underwater was that, according to Otto Muck, the mountains have only got a weathering life of something like 15,000 years, and then they start to become rounded. Maybe the same thing happens with this type of thing, where you're talking about things start to look less man-made because they become more rounded under the ocean more than 15,000 years or something.
I'm just trying to think of the Azores. They're a separate island group to the Canary Islands, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so.
Because the Canary Islands also appear to be a part of Atlantis. And I know on Canary Islands there is structures that are pyramids that are very ancient. But I think they're in a similar area to the Azores.
Yeah, well, they may very well be. I mean, spheres of influence, I guess, are the other thing, you know. I mean, it's quite possible that there could have been several kingdoms that owe their allegiance to Atlantis, or well, you probably know that with Atlantis, the claim is that there was the king who, I forget his name now. Anyway, Poseidon. Was it King Poseidon? I don't know. But the king had 5 sets of twins, boys, and each one of them he gave a part of the kingdom of Atlantis. Now, whether that meant they also had some of the islands on the outer skirts of the empire, or whether they were all actually on the mainland of Atlantis itself, I'm not sure.
One of the other interesting things of the Canary Islands is that this came out last year after the tsunami, when they were looking at world problems, the tsunamis. The Canaries, like the Azores, are these mountain structures in the middle of the ocean. And one of the islands has a particular cliff area that is going to fall into the sea, and it's slowly weathering and slowly moving, sliding. And they say that if it slides into the sea, it will be one mighty sort of splash, and it will cause a tsunami that would wipe out New York. And this was a series program that was made in the States, and that's why they were concerned. But it may happen tomorrow, it may happen in 1,000 years' time, but it's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
Yes.
Well, one of the things they're doing now with satellite technology and all the rest of it is they're actually mapping, and you probably get it on the internet, where they can take electromagnetic whatever, and they're finding all these circles where old meteorite hits and were all the way around, and they're finding them, they're actually crossing over, and so they're now able to start putting sort of approximate dates. This one happened before that one and that one. And the one down in the Gulf of Mexico, where that one 65 million years ago, and when you look at the magnetic anomalies of the Earth that are around there, it stands out like it happened yesterday. And that's the one that caused all that stuff in all those underwater rivers and stuff like that, because it lifted it all up, because they were all formed in dry. They were above water when they were formed. And that's what happened. It was all up there, and then when that happened, it collapsed it all down or something.
Well, I know one of those books there mentioned something about one of the land masses that was once a seaport and now is one of the highest villages in the area. I think it's one of the villages in Peru.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was
They
once-
wondered why they had a loading dock when they didn't have wheeled
Yeah.
vehicles or something. And they scratched their heads. Some bloke said maybe it was a seaport, and then it all made sense.
Yeah, and apparently they found seashells and that type of thing there as well. And well, this is what might have been a part of this upheaval of the earth and caused that to happen.
Well, Lake Titicaca, the highest lake in the world, it's got a very unique fauna there. It's freshwater now, but they've got things like the only freshwater seahorses and such, which sort of suggest that that originally it was full of salt water, and just gradually over the years the birds become fresh, and in that time it's given the inhabitants a chance to evolve into freshwater forms.
I wonder if there's any eels there.
I wonder.
Because the lemmings is another case for the Atlantis there too, because I've heard it said that they consider that the lemmings used to actually go to it along a land bridge that was there to...
And they're looking for the land bridge.
Yes, that's why they go over the edge. But I mean, that's just a theory, but...
Well, they say that sometimes about whales that beach themselves. That every now and then the leader's got this genetic memory of a certain way to go, and that one goes up there and they all die on the thing, and then another one becomes the leader and it hasn't got the genetic memory, so it doesn't crash on the beach next time.
Yeah.
And there was some fellow was theorising on that, and he was trying to convince these people not to run around and push them back in the water. They said it won't do any good or something. Keeps the people happy.
Oh,
It's
it's
time to
covered
finish
a lot
again.
of territory tonight, haven't we?